Good evening to everyone. Happy Monday evening. And we'll get started. Another episode of The Presidents and the Jews. Last time we ended with Abraham Lincoln, who by far had more involvement and a greater number of relationships with Jewish individuals than any president before him. We also saw that in the Jewish community, as a kind of complement to his stature, there were those who sought to quote unquote prove Lincoln's Jewish background, which honestly is very fanciful, but still interesting to see the attempts that were that were made. So we are at the end of the Civil War. Lincoln tragically is assassinated not even a week after Lee surrenders to Grant at Appomattox. There is still a little bit more of the Civil War to take place. There are battles for a few more months in various locales. Johnson, who has the other large army in North Carolina, surrenders to William Tecumseh Sherman. There are still battles that take place for several months more in the Trans-Mississippi Theater of War. But essentially, with Lee's surrender at Appomattox, the Civil War draws to a close. Now, Lincoln, in order to better his chances of re-election, partners with Andrew Johnson, who is not a Republican. He is a Democrat, but he is a Union Democrat. The technical ticket on which they run is not the Republican ticket, but a Union ticket, a Union fusion ticket, as it's sometimes referred to, with Lincoln in the top billing as president, and Andrew Johnson as a Democrat running as vice president. The idea was the hope that together they would draw more strength, and when the party goes into the election mode of 1864, things are very uncertain. He's running against a very popular Democrat, General McClellan, and it's not clear that Lincoln will win. What helps Lincoln's chances of victory is the capture of Atlanta in the early fall of 1864, and that becomes a huge part of reviving Union hopes for a victory in the near future. Lincoln is elected by a quite convincing and large majority. Johnson is rather an odd duck. He is a slaveholder from Tennessee who agrees to the 13th Amendment, the emancipation of slaves, but is by no means otherwise an abolitionist. He is not a fan of enfranchisement or, in any way addressing or redressing the wrongs of slavery. He is, though, a dedicated supporter of the Union, paid a very high price among Tennessee secessionists. He had to flee Tennessee and go to Washington, D.C. at the beginning of the Civil War. He is the only senator from the South not to resign with secession. When he comes to the office, he believes himself the heir to Lincoln's softer policies of Reconstruction. Lincoln did not want to take a punitive approach with the South. He wanted to, as much as possible, let bygones be bygones. What we'll never know is how Lincoln might have dealt with the intractable problem of trying to reach out to the South while at the same time doing right by the 3.5 million freed slaves who were living in the United States. Both of those goals ended up being mutually exclusive. The South could barely swallow abolition, the emancipation of slaves, let alone the 14th and 15th Amendments that guaranteed them all of the rights of citizenship, and at least for men, the right of the vote. In any event, so Johnson is no friend of Black Americans, wants to, even though he was a devoted unionist, wants to speed the process of reintegration of the Southern states into the Union. And it's a powder keg waiting to explode because the Congress is filled with Republicans, right? Since none of the Southern delegations had been seated, Johnson tried to fast track that while Congress was in recess, but when they got back into session, they blew his plan sky high. The radical Republicans, as they were called, were in the driver's seat, and there really was very little that Johnson could do about it. During the war and immediately before it, Johnson did publicly express anti-Semitism toward two gentlemen in particular, whom we've already met. One was David Levy Yulee, right? Senator from our own state of Florida, who had converted to Christianity, ardent slaveholder, ardent secessionist, and Judah P. Benjamin. So this is what Johnson had to say when he was talking to Charles Francis Adams, who was John Quincy Adams' son. He called Yulee, quote, "a contemptible little Jew begging us to let Florida in as a state. Well, we let her in and took care of her. And now that despicable little beggar stands up in the Senate and talks about her rights." Concerning Judah P. Benjamin, he was even more acrimonious. He would say in a speech, this is a speech, it's in the senatorial record, Mr. Benjamin of Louisiana is one who understands something about the idea of dividing garments. He belongs to that tribe that parted the garments of our Savior, and in this venture cast lots. He went out of this body, resigning from the Senate, and was made Attorney General of the Confederacy to show his quote unquote patriotism. So talking about, selling Jesus's clothing, dividing his garments, and selling them by lots, it's a pretty harsh way of referring to Judah P. Benjamin. Now, was he anti-Semitic because he was opposed to their secessionist leanings and just used that language because of their politics? Or did he reserve a special acrimony for them because they were Jews? And he was known for having a temper, especially if he had anything to drink. And while not known as a drunkard, there were some inauspicious occasions when he did get drunk, like the day of the inauguration, gave a speech before the Senate, at the time of his inauguration was incomprehensible. He was slurring his words. Nobody could understand a thing that he said. Not a really an auspicious beginning for the vice president of the United States. Um, in any event, though, when he left office, he did serve as a keynote speaker at the dedication of the Vine Street Temple in Nashville in 1874. Johnson was impeached and narrowly avoided conviction by a single vote. It was one vote in the Senate between him and being the only president in our history to be ousted. Since none of the southern states had been reseated, the Republican majority in both houses of Congress had comfortable margins to overcome all of his vetoes. And I may be wrong, but I am not sure that there has ever been quite as many overrides of presidential vetoes as during Johnson's term in the White House. A little piece of trivia: Johnson vetoed the 14th Amendment when it came to his desk. It's the only constitutional amendment, to my knowledge, that a president had vetoed, but still came to pass because Congress overrode the veto, and then the requisite number of states, the three-quarters number of states, ratified the amendment. Another interesting fact of Johnson: he's the only president who was reelected to office as a senator. John Quincy Adams served as a congressman after his presidency, but Andrew Johnson was elected to a Senate seat from Tennessee, but he only served for 5 months before he died of a stroke at the age of 66 in 1875. So he did not have nice things to say about Jews who were secessionists. We really don't know much more about what his attitudes were to the Jews in general, except for the fact that he did speak at the dedication of a synagogue in Nashville, Reformed congregation, in 1875. All right, which gets us to Ulysses S. Grant. We talked a little bit about Grant when we talked about Lincoln, because of that infamous General Order Number 11. This was at the end of 1862. And to understand why Grant kicks Jews out of his department, which included parts of Tennessee, Mississippi, and Kentucky, you have to understand a little bit about the background. With the outbreak of war, the value of cotton exponentially increases in the North and in Europe. And despite the fact that there is an embargo on it, the planters continue to grow it. This is their big crop. The US government wasn't much help because it issued a very confusing trade policy. Basically, it was for legal trade to follow the American flag, right? As the Union Army moved into different parts of the South, Treasury agents were able to issue permits to quote unquote loyal citizens, right? The idea being to reconcile locals, right, Southerners, to the federal government by giving them an advantage, right, to broker for certain things, and also to benefit the northern economy, right, allowing the flow of needed southern products like cotton, right? Also, that trade could help pay for the humongous cost of the Civil War. It was a hugely costly war. So that looked great from Washington. But if you were in the military and you were in any of the hot zones, right, where there was fighting, um, you could see how often goods that were traded by quote unquote loyal citizens found their way southward in exchange for cotton. Like cotton could be used to buy all kinds of things that the South needed. So the government expected the army to seize captured cotton for sale to benefit the treasury. But if you were, if you were quote unquote a patriot, patriotic Confederate, you burned your cotton, even though that was, essentially ruining yourself, but you burned your cotton. Otherwise, if you just weren't willing to lose every cent and lose your shirt, you would sell it to speculators in exchange for gold, which the Confederacy could use to purchase things because Confederate money was not worth very much in the market. And the illegal and black market speculation that went on was lucrative enough to warrant the risk. Speculators, could buy, who bought cotton, could profit enough to bribe union officials to look away, or even sometimes to help them in moving the cotton through the lines. So the wartime cotton trade in the Mississippi Valley enraged and outraged patriotic Northerners. There were lots and lots of unscrupulous traders who were enabling the Confederacy to fight more effectively by supplying them with gold and scarce goods through the purchase of cotton. And unfortunately, journalists and military officers blame this trade on Jews. We know from the historical record that there were a number of Jews who engaged in this, illegal, speculative, and immoral, unethical trade. There were, but the vast, vast majority were not. Out of 200 or 300 that were caught and for whom there's documentation, no more than a half dozen were Jewish. However, we all know what kind of anti-Semitic stereotypes exist about Jews and greed and money and speculation. So a very few bad apples, plus the fact that the few bad apples not really for much of this speculative trade. Now, General Grant's Order Number 11 is particularly pernicious, not because he talks about Jewish peddlers or Jewish speculators, but because the language of it is to expel Jews as a class. Those are his words, Jews as a class. So in other words, if you read the literal wording of the order, to engage in this, and therefore they should all be evicted from the department, i.e., the territory that he was in charge of as a major general at the end of 1862. So, what probably contributes to Grant's anger is that shortly before he issues Order Number 11, his dad arrives in Mississippi to buy cotton for a Jewish firm in Cincinnati in return for 1/4 of the profits, right? Jesse Grant Ulysses' dad, is looking to trade on his famous son's name, right? He can have, right? He knows people, right? So he, um, this cotton, this illegal cotton, this black market cotton at very low cost, be used by this Jewish-owned um, manufacturing firm to make uniforms for the army, right? That are then sold back to the army for another cost. Now, Jesse Grant was a character. He is the one that got Ulysses Grant an appointment to West Point. He didn't want to go to West Point. His father forced him to go to West Point. They had a very strained and difficult relationship throughout Grant's life. He was a shrewd businessman. Um, a neighbor of Jesse Grant's remembering him as, quote, willing to follow a dollar to hell. Right. So when Ulysses resigned from the army, right, Grant had a lot of failure before he, before he found redemption as the commanding general of the Union Army. He resigned from the army. He had a number of scandals. There were allegations that he was a drunk. There is good evidence that Grant was an alcoholic, although he could abstain from drinking for very long periods, and seemingly, be in complete recovery. And then whatever it is that set him off, and he would go into a tailspin and really fall off the wagon very, very badly. When he got back on, it could be years. But be that as it may, when Grant resigned from the army 15 years earlier, it was his father-in-law, not his father, who helped him establish a farm. And when that failed, and eventually Grant had to work in his father's leather store in Galena, Illinois, Jesse Grant put his younger brother in charge of Ulysses, and he worked for a pittance of a salary. So already there's a complicated relationship. And when Jesse shows up, right, with the hope that with these Jewish garment manufacturers, that they can make a killing on cornering black market cotton, it may be that Grant blew up and focused his ire on the Jews rather than on his father. But I mean, that's completely speculative. We don't know, but we do know that calling Jews as a class and expelling them. Now, in some places, the order wasn't enforced. One officer, whose name I forget, refused to enforce it. He said, "I am not, being Jewish is a faith, and I am not a minister. I am an officer of the army. It's not for me to decide who, by what demonstration of faith, should be expelled." There was a captain, a Jewish captain, who resigned his commission, who was Captain Philip Tronstein, 5th Ohio Cavalry, who wrote a letter of resignation saying that, quote, either fortunately or unfortunately, I am born of Jewish parents. I owe filial affection to my parents, devotion to my religion, and a deep regard for the opinion of my friends. And I could no longer bear the taunts and malice of those whom know my religious opinions. So a delegation of Jewish civic leaders go to Washington within about a week and a half, 2 weeks after Order Number 11. And they meet with Lincoln on January 3rd, 1863, 2 days after the Emancipation Proclamation. And Lincoln immediately orders the chief of the Army Staff, General Halleck, to rescind the order. And Halleck points out that the problem was the languages was the phrase Jews as a class, right? If he had said, speculators, including, Jews, that wouldn't have been, very nice or politically correct. But when you say Jews as a class, you're painting an entire group with a single brush, and Lincoln was not going to stand for it. There was a huge backlash in the Jewish community. Isaac Mayer Weiss, one of the preeminent Reform rabbis at the time, wrote an editorial: Israelites, citizens of the United States, you have been outraged, your rights as men and citizens trampled in the dust, your honor disgraced. As a class, you've been officially degraded. It is your duty to bring this matter clearly before the President of the United States and demand redress. This haunted Grant when he ran for president in 1868. Isaac Mayer Weiss urged Jews not to support him, saying, if there are any among us who lick the feet that kick them like dogs, if there are persons small enough to receive indecencies without resentment, we hope their number is small. Congress even debated a motion of censure against Grant for General Order Number 11. But because Grant was so successful, especially as we get into 1863, and he is the victor at Vicksburg, right after, or actually the day before, the day after Gettysburg, that the motion fades away. But Jews, have long memories. Grant himself later admitted, not publicly, but to confidants, that that his order was not well thought out, and he always regretted it. The truth is, there really is no, anti-Semitism that Grant ever expresses. I mean, General Order Number 11 is a big one, but there really is nothing else in his writings, speeches, correspondence that suggests any animus toward Jews. In fact, we know much earlier, when he was a young Army officer, he was a lieutenant and stationed in Watertown, New York, that he became friends with Jesse Seligman. Seligman's later, they become very wealthy merchants and bankers. But Jesse Seligman, has a store in Watertown, and which the Grants patronize frequently, and they become friends. Mostly he buries General Order Number 11. He doesn't mention it in his autobiography. But then again, he doesn't mention his episodes with struggling with alcohol either. His widow, however, Julia Dent Grant, did address it. She called it obnoxious in her own autobiography, which she wrote after his death. And she reported that Grant felt the reprimand he received for the order was deserved, for he had no right to make an order against any special sect. Those were her words. Some Jews, really never forgave Grant, and compared him even to Haman, which seems a little extreme. There were others who were willing to forgive Grant his blunder. In truth, and here's the irony, Grant appointed more Jews to public office than any president before him, including Lincoln. He offered the Secretary of Treasury to Jesse Seligman, right, his old friend, who declined it. Seligman was a very retiring kind of fellow and didn't want to be in the public light in government. In 1869, Grant successfully intervenes with the Tsarist government, convinces Russia to rescind an expulsion order for 20,000 Jews in southwestern Russia. There's a little irony, right? Grant's own order of expulsion, which really was not enforced for the most part. There were some places, like 30 Jewish families that were kicked out of Paducah, Kentucky. But in his presidency, he saves 20,000 Jews from expulsion because of his forceful intervention with Tsarist Russia. And when Romanian Jews, Romania, the country, becomes independent in 1870, and there is anti-Semitism, Grant takes the unusual step of appointing a Jew as the U.S. consul to Romania, Benjamin Franklin, love the name, Benjamin Franklin Peixato, Sephardic. Family went back to pre-Revolutionary War America. Peixato was also a past president of B'nai B'rith, and Grant did it quite deliberately. It wasn't just a matter of coincidence that he was Jewish. He thought that that made a point, and as well as Peixato being able to monitor the situation more closely. Finally, Simon Wolf. I'm going to put up a picture for you. Let's see, here we are. Go into screen share. Let's see. Hopefully everybody can see. There's Simon Wolf. Good buddy with Lincoln. We'll see his name again. He is going to come up with a variety of presidents throughout the late 19th century. He's an attorney. He is a Jewish communal leader. He will later go on to be the American consul to Egypt. But he is good friends with Grant. And Grant appoints him as the recorder of deeds for the District of Columbia, a job that he would hold for 10 years. Really a patronage job. He would hold that for 10 years until Rutherford B. Hayes actually forced him to, dismissed him. Simon Wolf and Grant become sufficiently close that Grant serves as the Kvater at Simon Wolf's son's bris. Right? As far as I know, it is the only case of an American president who plays a role at a bris. I could be wrong, but I don't think so. So he is the Kvater, he's the one who brings the baby in. At Simon Wolf's son's bris in 1869. And Simon Wolf names the boy Adolph Grant Wolf in honor of U.S. Grant. In addition, when Addis Israel congregation, Addis Israel, which exists to this day, it's a conservative synagogue in D.C., it's a breakaway synagogue from Washington Hebrew congregation. By the way, not all breakaways have the name Shalom in it. That's the old theory that if you are a breakaway congregation, you have to have the word Shalom in it. Not always true, and it wasn't true in that case. In 1876, a group of more traditional Jews did not like the direction that Washington Hebrew congregation was going in. So they broke away, formed it was an Orthodox synagogue. The conservative movement really didn't exist. And Grant attends the dedication, the cornerstone laying of the synagogue. Share this. Let's see. Let's see. Got it? No, here it is. All right. Here's the program. Order of service to the congregation, a consecration of the synagogue Addis Israel. Interestingly, the program was printed in New York. Who knows why, but it took place on a Friday in 1876. And Grant is there. And at the end, Grant makes a contribution to the shul. I don't know if they cash the check, um, but that would be quite a souvenir today to have a check from Ulysses S. Grant as a contribution to your school. So you have to judge for yourself. Was U.S. Grant, and a person possessed of anti-Semitic leanings? And my own answer, my own guess is no. But it doesn't mean that he was immune to all of the prejudices of his time. Um, though he was generally free of personal prejudice. One of his most valued aides, Eli Parker, was a Native American who rose to the rank of colonel. He was known to deal, fairly on an individual basis with people of all races, creeds, colors. So I leave it up to you to judge, but I tend to think that he made a terrible blunder, but that he was not anti-Semitic. But you can disagree. So Grant finishes his second term and steps down, and there's no law that you can't run for a third term, but he's persuaded not to, especially there is an economic downturn in 1873 that's very significant, and his friends tell him, this is not a good time for you to win. So the Republican candidate is a kind of colorless fellow named Rutherford B. Hayes. This is one of the most questionable elections ever, 1876. And I got to tell you, it makes this past election. Let me put it this way: as far as anybody can see, there have been no credible allegations of fraud, other than simply, saying that there was. In 1876, there is a lot of smoke, and it's hard to see through that smoke. Samuel Tilden, who is the governor of New York and a Democrat, thinks he's won. He's got 250,000 more votes than Hayes, and he's ahead in the Electoral College, 184 to 165. He's just one vote shy of the threshold of victory. Here was the dilemma: South Carolina, Florida, and Louisiana, 3 southern states where you had lots of Black voters who were all Republican. And there were enough of them to have made a difference in swinging the electoral votes to Hayes. So Republicans claimed with a certain amount of real credibility that Black voters had been disenfranchised in the 3 southern states, right? And they would have made the difference. And we'll never know. But, we know that Black voters were intimidated, it was, you took your life into your hands if you were a Black voter in these southern states. So Congress creates a 15-member electoral commission, with representatives from the House, Senate, and Supreme Court to decide, what to do with these allegations and the votes. There are 8 Republicans and 7 Democrats. So what do you think happens? Who wins? The vote is 8-7. You don't have to guess along what lines. So a number of party leaders get behind closed doors, and they handle, they negotiate. This is the smoky back room at its smokiest, and they hammer out a compromise, which is the disputed states will be considered to have gone to Hayes. So Hayes will get the electoral votes he needs to win. But, this is the big but, Hayes will agree as president to remove all of the remaining U.S. troops from southern states who had been there to enforce Reconstruction. In other words, federal troops had on many occasions protected Black office holders, Black voters, and the Republicans who were negotiating this behind, backdoor, backroom, smoky room deal, say, okay. So, the irony is it's the Black vote in South Carolina, Louisiana, and Florida, which ensure that Rutherford B. Hayes will serve as president. It will also be that same deal, that same victory, which will ensure that Black voters will be disenfranchised for the better part of a century thereafter. So in 1877, Rutherford B. Hayes pulls out the remaining troops. And not surprisingly, all of the state governments become Democrat overnight, and Black voters in a variety of ways through terrorism and through illegality and through laws that are passed by these all white Southern legislatures are fully and completely disenfranchised from political life. Hayes himself was deeply religious. Morning prayers and nightly hymn singing were regular features of White House life. Tobacco was banned. So was liquor. No profanity. Mrs. Hayes was known as Lucy Lemonade. Lucy was her first name. Lucy Lemonade, because she was a temperance lady. And obviously, many of Washington's politicians were not so enamored of this pious approach. After one official state dinner, the Secretary of State, William Evarts, wryly remarked, "It was a brilliant affair. The water flowed like champagne." Because of his religiosity, Hayes, though, was sensitive to Shomer Shabbos individuals. And so he personally got involved when a Jewish applicant for a position at the Department of the Interior was turned down for a job because he didn't want to work on Saturdays. So he had been turned down for the job because he was Shomer Shabbos, and Hayes intervened, saying, "Anyone who would rather forego a job than violate the Sabbath is a good citizen and worthy of appointment." And so Hayes actually set a standard that you couldn't discriminate against people for being Sabbath observant, and that was largely because of his own deep, Christian sensibilities. I mentioned Simon Wolfe, right? He had worked diligently on behalf of Hayes. He had stumped across Ohio, Indiana, and New York. But once Hayes is elected or selected, depending on how you want to look at his win, he dismisses Wolfe from his job as Recorder of Deeds of Washington, D.C. Simon Wolfe was very angry about this because of all of his support. He always suspected that it was his opposition. Wolfe was very much opposed to temperance. He'd been born in Germany, drank beer, belonged to a number of German American societies where beer was served, and so he was opposed to temperance. And he always believed that Hayes had it in for him because he was an opponent of temperance, and that caused his downfall from political favor. So let me stop here before we go any farther. Any questions about Grant, Johnson, Grant, Hayes. Go ahead, Manny.
Hey, good evening. You mentioned about Simon Wolf's connections with Grant and how Grant went to the consecration of Adas Israel.
Yeah.
Adas Israel is not only active, still active. That's where Ruth Bader Ginsburg belonged. You remember that during the service, the main rabbi who spoke was
Yes,
the
Mr. Mattis.
Adas Israel. So
Yeah.
it goes down through the years. In fact,
Yes.
one of my best friends was married at Adas Israel.
Yeah, no, it's a big.
I was married to Jackson
social
Jewish
hall.
Center.
I have been there. It's
Yeah.
and I know the rabbi. Washington Hebrew also still exists.
Oh, yeah, we know that. We have relatives belong there. Their rabbi, when he died, he laid in state in the lobby.
The Washington Hebrew
That was
congregation.
years ago. I mean, we know they used to blow a bugle at Rosh Hashanah, and then they finally trained someone to blow a shofar. But
That was the Washington Hebrew.
that was Washington Hebrew.
Yeah. I mean, that was not
different.
so uncommon.
A little different, but fun.
Any other questions about
One Rabbi,
Grant to
one of the
Garfield?
things.
Yeah, go ahead, Leon.
Uh,
Is that Leon?
How are you? Yeah, I'm hiding tonight. One of the things that I've been reading Grant's autobiography, which was actually co-authored by Mark Twain. And one of the things that early on, after he had left the service and was working on getting his the farm going, he had a slave that was worth $1,100 in those days, which was today would be quite a lot of money. Obviously, 1,100 in pre-Civil War and Civil War time was a lot. And he said he gave him his freedom, as opposed to paying or selling them. And that was the kind of character that he had. So just to perceive him as anti-Semitic or any involved of that way, it just, it spoke very highly of his actions and who he was.
Yes. By the way, if you're interested, there is a whole book by historian Jonathan D. Sarna, When General Grant Expelled the Jews. So it's, let's see, it's published by, Shotgun Books. But it came out a few years ago. I mean, it's only maybe 8-9 years. But When General Grant Expelled the Jews, by Jonathan Sarna. James A. Garfield. So let's just take a moment for a musical interlude. And I have really become a fan of campaign songs. And this is already now, this is 15 years after the Civil War, but there is still sentiment that is raw, very raw. And this was a Garfield campaign song. I'm gonna put it up on the screen and then play the
Battery 5. Connected to Galaxy F10.
all right, hopefully everybody can see that. Let's see. Here we go.
If the Johnnies get into power again, aha, aha. If the Johnnies get into power again, aha, aha. Our laws they'll cheer, our flags they'll flout, they'll try to turn our officers out, and we'll all wear gray if the Johnnies get into power. Jeff Davis's name they'll proudly praise, aha, aha. And Lincoln's tomb will be disgraced, aha, aha. The nation's flag will lose its stars, the stripes they'll change to rebel bars, and we'll all wear gray if the Johnnies get into power. Let that day of Jubilee, hurrah, hurrah. The Johnnies they will never see, ha ha, ha ha. We have the pluck, the Yankee wit will make the grayback rebels get, and we'll all be fools if the Johnnies get into power. Then cheer for Garfield 3 times 3, hurrah! Hurrah! For Arthur and for victory, hurrah! Hurrah! We'll put them in, there is no doubt. We'll keep the grayback Johnnies out, and there'll be no day when the Johnnies get into power. And there'll be no day when the Johnnies get into power.
So, whoever said that political hyperbole is an invention of, 2016 or 2020. Here's what's so ironic is that the guy running against Garfield was uh, Scott Winfield Hancock. And Scott Winfield Hancock was a Civil War hero who was wounded. I mean, he was one of the generals lionized for his performance at the Battle of Gettysburg. So he had made some conciliatory statements about the South after the war, but he was, he was not a sympathizer. He was not a former Confederate. He was a Union general who played a very important role in the Civil War. And yet, all right, if Johnny gets into power, right, which will happen if you, so that kind of rhetoric is not new. We may think it is, but it's just not. So James Garfield, he's born in rural Ohio. He's the last president to have been born in a log cabin. He graduates though from Williams College in Williamstown, Massachusetts. So he has, a pretty solid degree. He becomes a college president of a small Christian school, Hiram College, at 26. He's a college president at 26. I mean, gosh, overachiever. He becomes the youngest general in the Union Army at age 30, but he resigns from the Army to run for Congress. He becomes a leader of the Republican Party during 17 years in the House. He's a great orator. He's a great speechifier. In fact, he shows up at the Republican Party convention in time for the 1880 election, and he's there to give a speech nominating John Sherman, Senator Sherman, who at that time was Secretary of the Treasury, had been formerly an Ohio senator. And so he gives this really passionate nominating speech for Sherman, and Sherman is William Tecumseh Sherman's brother. But people love his speaking so much that they totally forget about Sherman, and they nominate him. So he ends up he shows up the Republican Party. I mean, that stuff doesn't happen anymore. But he shows up to make a nomination for somebody else, and is so well received that he ends up being the candidate. He's elected. His term in office is tragically short. Simon Wolf, right, that perennial Jewish communal leader of Washington, D.C., who is the friend of so many presidents from Lincoln on, he is appointed by Garfield to be the U.S. consul to Egypt. And Garfield is he appoints, by the way, he appoints him the day before he is shot in July of 1881. And Garfield thought it was amazing that he was appointing a Jew as consul to Egypt, and he compares Wolfe to the biblical Joseph. And then he writes Wolfe again that day before his shooting, "I am happy to name a descendant of a people who had been enslaved by the Egyptians as a representative to that country from a great free land." So he thought that he was kind of restaging the story of Joseph in Egypt. Garfield is tragically assassinated. He lingers for 2.5 months after his shooting, dying in mid-September. We don't have time to talk about the story of his assassination, but very tragic, and he probably could have been saved But he just had the misfortune of living at a time when some doctors believed in antisepsis and other doctors didn't. And the doctor in charge of his care just had dogmatically made up his mind where the bullet was, even though Alexander Graham Bell had invented an early metal detector to use, and it identified where the bullet was, but it wasn't where his physician, claimed it would be. So therefore, the machine had to be wrong, and he had to be right. But when they did an autopsy, the bullet was exactly where the metal detector had indicated. But in any event, Garfield dies after lingering for 2.5 months, and Chester A. Arthur becomes president. People really, don't give Chester A. Arthur much credit. I mean, the truth is he never thought to be president. He was not presidential material. He was a product of the smoky back rooms and behind the scenes of political life. But actually, Arthur steps up to the plate, and he proves many of his detractors wrong. He actually turns out to be a pretty decent president. Despite being a product of the political spoil system, he actually becomes an advocate of civil service, right? He advocates the civil service, the establishment of the Civil Service Commission, right? Which institutes a merit system for awarding federal jobs. He has a strong relationship also with Simon Wolf. He appoints any number of Jews to positions of, as candidates to Annapolis and to West Point. And here's a very interesting thing. He's a very strong supporter of the Treaty of Geneva, which establishes the International Red Cross. And he appoints Clara Barton, right? We all know Clara Barton. And he appoints Clara Barton and a guy named Adolphus Solomons to be the first delegates representing the US. Now, Solomons is a political confidant of both Lincoln and Grant. And he had played a pivotal role in establishing James A. Garfield Memorial Hospital. Solomons had really single-handedly been the most important force establishing James A. Garfield Memorial Hospital, the first hospital in Washington, D.C. When Garfield was shot, there was no hospital for him to go to. Many years later, it would join with 2 other hospitals to become Washington Hospital Center, right, which is a major hospital center. One of the routinely in the top 100, hospitals in the United States. It's a major teaching institution. So one of the forerunners of Washington Hospital is James A. Garfield Memorial Hospital, established by Adolphus Solomons. And Solomon is one of the founders of the American Red Cross. So it's interesting to see he's appointed by Chester A. Arthur as the first American delegates to the International Red Cross. And Chester A. Arthur has, he has 1 term in office, and that is it. And then he goes back to lead a quiet life, but he dies very shortly after leaving office. So we've quickly, let's see, we may save the rest for next time. We'll end with Grover Cleveland. And then Grover Cleveland is the only president to serve 2 non-consecutive terms. So he was elected in 1884. He lost in 1888, but he was back in 1892. During his first term in office, the Austro-Hungarian Empire refuses to accept the U.S. ambassador. They won't accept his credentials. Why? Because his wife is Jewish. John Keeley was his name. So Cleveland not only condemns the intolerance, he leaves the post vacant. He does not appoint anyone else. He said, if you don't want this guy, okay, I can't force you to accredit a diplomat, to your court, but I'm not sending anyone else. In his second term, Cleveland goes on to address B'nai B'rith at its 50th anniversary with really high words of praise. And as Jewish immigration increases dramatically in the 1880s and 1890s in response to Tsarist persecution, Congress begins to show some resurgence of xenophobia and nativism. Congress passes a compulsory educational test for immigrants, which Cleveland vetoes as discriminatory. Even after leaving office, Cleveland continues to speak out against anti-Semitism in Tsarist Russia. Most famously at a protest at Carnegie Hall in 1903 after the notorious Kishinev pogrom. Now, Cleveland was very friendly with the three Strauss brothers, right? There's Oscar, Isidore, and Nathan. Isidore and Nathan were partners in and later sole owners of R.H. Macy and Company. So next time, we don't have any Macy's here, but you go to Orlando or wherever else and you walk into a Macy's, you're walking into what was the Strauss's department store. Oscar Strauss was not involved so much in the family business. He graduated from Columbia University Law School, devoted his life to public service. Cleveland appoints Oscar to serve as U.S. Minister to Turkey. Isidore Strauss is very active in re-electing Cleveland in 1892. Cleveland wants Isidore to be Secretary of Treasury. It's interesting how Jews are always offered this position and turn it down. The first Jewish cabinet member does not happen until until Teddy Roosevelt. But nevertheless, he also offered him Postmaster General, which Strauss turned down and ended up running for a congressional seat. They were very close with the Strauss family. I'll put up a picture for a second. Just find it. There we go. Share that. No. Okay. Share this. Right. Doing this. Here we go. There we are. Screen. All right. Lovely couple. That's Isidore and Ida Strauss. They had a wonderful, wonderful marriage. They took a long trip to Europe and were very excited to return on this spanking brand new ocean liner that was sailing from Southampton in April of 1912. You got it. It was the Titanic. And Ida was offered a seat in one of the lifeboats, but she refused to leave Isidore behind, and they both drowned. They both went down with the ship. But Oscar Strauss remained a close friend of the Clevelands, and he would send the president a case of matzah every Pesach. So he sent Grover Cleveland a case of matzah every year from the 1880s until Cleveland's death in 1908. I don't know, why Cleveland liked matzah so much. I often find that, you know, I don't want to generalize, but somehow that non-Jews seem to like matzah more than Jews. I don't know why that is. But anyway, go figure. But if you ever want to know which president got a case of matzah every year for almost 30 years, that would be Grover Cleveland. At the celebration of the 250th anniversary of the first Jews arriving in the New World, Grover Cleveland spoke in 1905 at Carnegie Hall, and he said, "It is time for the unreserved acknowledgement that the toleration and equal opportunity accorded the Jews of the United States have been abundantly repaid to us. I know that human prejudice, especially that growing out of race or religion, is cruelly inveterate and lasting. But wherever in the world prejudice against the Jews still exists, there can be no place for it among the people of the United States, unless they are heedless of good faith, unaware of the underlying principles of their free government, and insensible to every pledge involved in our boasted equality of citizenship." So such was Grover Cleveland. And we'll stop there. We'll start briefly with Benjamin Harrison and William McKinley before we jump into Teddy Roosevelt. But again, let me, questions, comments, thoughts. Manny.
Yeah. You asked why do some Christians like matzah? When I was stationed in Greenland, there were very few Jews on base, maybe about 5 or 7.
Yeah.
And one of the fellows, I think it was the lawyer, said, "Let's try to get together for Friday night Shabbos, a little type of prayers." So we went to the chapel and we rifled through one of the drawers of the priest, the Catholic chaplain. Sorry, I'm pretty old now. And in there was a bottle of Manischewitz and a box of matzah crackers for their communion. So sometimes Catholic priests in dire straits will use matzah for communion.
Right. But I mean, it's interesting that now Grover Cleveland wasn't Catholic.
Yeah, well, so,
I guess, I don't know. He just liked matzah.
or
Peanut butter.
maybe he just didn't want to embarrass his friend.
Maybe, although I think Cleveland, asked for it. So it became, by the way, not that this has anything to do with it, but right around this time is when you had the first machine-made matzah, which was a whole big deal. And there were a lot of people up in arms at how could this be kosher for Passover? And,
Right.
it's not traditional, right? How can you? So what we don't know is whether Strauss sent a machine-made matzah or, handmade matzah.
Also, I'm possibly the only person, if not the only Jew in Jacksonville, that was born in Garfield Hospital.
Yeah.
And
Oh,
Washington.
you?
Yes.
Okay. Did you know that Adolphus Solomons was the founder? Was a Jewish guy who, a Shomer Shabbos Jew from Washington, D.C.
No, I was not aware of that.
Yeah. So he really single-handedly, and by the way, the first 2 contributions that he raised for James A. Garfield Memorial Hospital were contributions from Washington Hebrew and Addis Israel. So I guess it was in the 50s that with Episcopal and there was another hospital that they all together became Washington Hospital Center.
Can I have bragging rights that my cousin is the education director at Washington Hebrew?
Sure. I mean, was he there when Franklin Pierce signed the charter?
I don't think so, but Joel Bressler might have been at Addis Israel then.
Right. Well, we'll find out. McKinley actually brings the whole cabinet when Washington Hebrew builds another building in 1897. I'll put up the photo. Why not? A nice photo of McKinley. This is in McKinley's first term. And there he is talking to the crowd at the dedication of the new Washington Hebrew building. I mean, what was new then in 1897. So I guess that's one of the perks of being in a synagogue in Washington, D.C. You get presidents that come visit. Obama spoke at I think he was the last president. Spoke at Addis. You know, you get presidents who come through when they live just down the road. We did have Mayor Brown
Yeah,
visit us.
yeah, I know.
You know, I don't know. I don't think he's ever been. You know, I don't know that we've had any.
Well, Tommy Hazuri went to the temple.
Yes, but I really like the fact that Grant was the godfather at a bris
That's amazing.
while in office. You know, so
Yeah.
you know, and he didn't do it. It was after. It was a good year after his election, so he wasn't just stumping for. You know,
Votes.
for votes at the time. Grant is also the first president, I believe, to visit the Holy Land.
Really? I thought he was.
He takes a trip around the world after his presidency. You know, unfortunately, his it's very sad at the end. He resigned from the army. Right, he was the commanding general of the army, and he would have been guaranteed a very decent pension, but he resigned to run for the presidency, and he lost his rights to any pension. And there was special legislation in the early 1880s because he was in dire need. And it passed the Senate, but there were about 20 or so former Confederate officers who were at that point members of the House.
They didn't vote for him.
They vetoed the pension. He got nothing and had a race against time. He was diagnosed with throat cancer and suffering excruciating pain. He raced to finish his autobiography so that, you know, hopefully there would be some money for his estate, for his wife to live on, because, you know, he had really nothing. And thankfully, there was almost $500,000 in royalties that came from that. And that supported Julia, you know, for the rest of her life. But it really came down to the wire.
Was there scandal in his administration? Was there a lot of scandal in his administration? Grant?
Yeah, Grant was pretty much of a straight arrow, but he also was very gullible and naive. He tended to believe the best of people. And there were all kinds of, there was a whiskey ring scandal and credit mobilier, and there were lots of, there was a lot of corruption. And Grant was not personally involved, but it tainted, you know, his administration for, you know, for sure. Wouldn't have been the first.
Right, or the last.
Or the last, for sure.
Oliver.
So, but anyway, if you encounter somebody, you know, an observant Jew in the civil service who doesn't have to work, for, you know, on Shabbos, say thank you to Rutherford B. Hayes. I mean, these are the little things that people don't necessarily know.
That's why we have you. That's why we have you, Rabbi.
Yeah, a font of
A wealth of knowledge.
or of useless information that's
No.
interesting.
Look,
But anyway,
I could be watching football and I'm tuned in, listening to you. You should be honored.
I am honored. I'm honored that we have somebody here who was born in James A. Garfield Memorial Hospital.
He didn't, the mother just happened to be there. He had nothing to do with it.
Well, I mean, I'm sure it was an even better hospital, Manny, after you were born.
You're right.
No, I reached its peak.
Good.
That's why he combined with two others to go to Washington
Enough.
Hospital Center.
They'd had enough of us. Goodbye. Hello, hello, Bruce. Goodbye.
Good
All
night.
right. Well, I'm going
Hey, good
to,
night, Gracie. Good night.
Good night, Rita.
Goodbye.
Good
Good night, Ilana.
You see my
I'll
neighbor.
see you all next time around. Have a good
Okay.
evening and
Good night, and
Very-
thank you very
Go
much.
Gators.
Thank you
Very,
very much.
You're doing
very
great,
informative,
Rabbi.
Rabbi.
Rabbi, keep on praying
Very
Saturday.
informative.
for
We
the
enjoyed
Gators.
it.
I will. Good night. Good night.
Good night.
Good night.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Care.